Okay, well, I'm really excited about this presentation and solving color value, composition, and design issues in textile arts. And I have a couple of questions from a couple of folks here and a couple of other examples of how problems were solved. So I hope everybody will find something of value. So let's go there. This is Leslie's. So Leslie's here today. She sent 3 photos, which are amazing photos, um, and how to maybe utilize these in a fiber art image. So we'll talk a little bit about all of them. Excuse me, this is an amazing photo. I love it. I love the color, the grayed out colors, and I love the sort of contrast between the warm and the more cool. It is it is a photo that would be really difficult to translate into fiber art. And that's an interesting thing to think about. Some of my most favorite photos that I've ever taken, in fact, I've won awards for a couple of them, are would not lend themselves to fiber art. So just because it's a good photo for regular photography doesn't mean it would be easy or effective to translate into fiber art. And this one would be pretty tricky. For a lot of reasons, partly is the value. I have a value scale on the right-hand side, so you can see there's not a lot of contrast in value here. Plus, I think it's an owl, but the bird is looking straight at you, which is really tricky with birds because it's easier to show that it's a bird if you can show part of the beak, and you don't really see the beak when it's foreshortened looking at you. So even though it's a really cool photo and I'd be inclined to enlarge it and hang it up on the wall as a poster, I don't really consider it a great candidate for fiber art. This one, however, is, and we have the value scale on the right. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, values have to do with light and dark, how on a grayscale, how a white is a light value, or we also call it a high value, and black is a dark value. So basically, when you're thinking in terms of value, what I used to tell my students in the olden days was try to take a photo in your head with a Polaroid camera, because back in those days, Polaroids were black and white. So it's kind of turn your brain into a camera and take a picture of what you're looking at in black and white, and that'll show you the values. So there's nice value contrast here. One of the best things is that there is a light value and dark value on the bird with a medium value in the background. So that gives good contrast and shows shows your subject matter well. Also, this bird has their head turned slightly, so that beautiful little triangle of light connotes the beak, and that is very useful.
Hey, Meryl,
Yes.
doesn't it matter what type of interpretation you're looking at? We don't necessarily have to do exact line replication of photographs. So can you think about, I mean, you don't necessarily have to use the grayscale that's inherent in the picture itself
You can
either, do you?
change your value scale. Sure. You sure can. It's unless you're really, really practiced with values, it's a lot harder to make up values that aren't there. So it's always easier um, to, sort of go by the value. But sure, these values could all be changed, and I do that a lot. I find with my students, being able to see and understand values is something that takes a lot of practice. And so a lot of people are not practiced enough to make significant changes for a while.
But if you do some research and you're looking at a lot of different photos and seeing how it's been done, I think well, obviously looking at other art always helps you interpret.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you can choose the one you like. The tricky bit there is when you're combining. So if you are really aware of light circumstances, you can combine more than one image effectively. But I've seen people combine two images where the light direction of the light was different in each of the two subject matters they put in. And that's kind of a
Yeah.
giveaway. So, but those are good questions. And we're going to see a little bit more about values here too. So, oops, sorry, I think it went backwards. Sorry. Okay. So, here is a good value question. So you want to check out these lighter spots on this wing. And we're going to talk about what value that is. So see if you can guess which value on this value scale those little lighter spots on the wing might be. And I'll give you a minute. You can see which number it is. And then we're going to actually check it and take a look. So when we take this value scale and line it up, you can see that number 7 is the gray that most closely matches that color in the wing, which we know is white. Our left brain knows it's white. It would be white if that bird was in sunlight, but it's not white when it's in shadow. So this is the exact spot where most textile artists and actually painters mess up, is by, if they have light values in the shadow, they don't make them dark enough. And when you don't make them dark enough, you lose the feeling of shadow, if that's what you're going for. So, so this is a really good technique to use to figure out values. Now, I have the value scale next to the breast of the bird there. And a good way to see values is to squint your eyes. And if you squint your eyes there, you'll probably notice that the value number 3, oh, I'm sorry, I have the values upside down. But the one that's number 3 right there is a little lighter than what we see on the breast of the bird. And number 4 is slightly darker. If when you squint your eyes, you can look at that edge on the right hand side that's touching that. And so the actual value for that would be halfway in between, right there. So the other thing I might do with this picture is that looks like the horizon line is a little slanted because the trees are growing up, you know, perpendicular to a slanted horizon line. So I would tilt the picture a little bit. And we've talked about rule of thirds before. This is an excellent photo to play around with rule of thirds if you want to. And so I just kind of arbitrarily put the bird on one of those lines. So in the rule of thirds, if you have your main subject thing, item, along one of those lines or in one of the 4 intersecting intersections, that usually gives you pretty good composition. And so on the right hand side, I just manufactured some more background to see how that would look. And you could do it square. I like since the bird is looking to the right, I like to give more space to the right. That's a typical artistic kind of technique, is to give more space to the area where the person or the animal is looking. And on the right hand side, so we have less space where it's looking and more space behind it. This is the same composition as the famous Joan of Arc painting in the Metropolitan Museum, which I probably should have put in here too, but she's standing on that right hand side looking away out of the picture, which is unusual. But the reason the artist did like that is in the upper left quadrant, the artist painted the vision of the angels. So when you're in a situation when you want to show a vision, then you usually show it behind the being. So, and then this one, I lowered it a little bit because I thought having the head up connected to the upper, that cross above it was a little too high. So I liked it lower. I liked the beak being exactly on that line there. I manufactured a few extra leaves to put in the right-hand corner. Now, what we have here is a beautiful curve you can see with the yellow. And so one of the things you can do if you want to create good composition is to extend that curve. And so I extend, so along the bottom here, it would be easy to extend that curve with the foliage. Now on the top, what would we do? Well, on the top, I think I would, rearrange the trees a little bit so that they follow that curve a little closer. It doesn't have to follow exactly, but if you get that flow going, it gives the observer's eye a place to look that's, you know, has some movement. So one of the ways I would do that would be a little bit with value. Now I've exaggerated it here, but it would be easy to make the value on the upper part of that yellow line a little lighter, and then the trees below that yellow line a little darker. So it'd be subtle, but it would create this feeling of movement. And she had this other amazing turtle picture, which I love. So what's going on with the turtle, and it depends what you're trying to do. If you want to create an image where the turtle is kind of lost in the foliage, then the value relationship on the left is really good because the grass and the foliage on the bottom has a greater value range than the turtle. In other words, the lighter lights and the darker darks are a bigger range in the background than on the object. But if you want to put focus on the object, you could do what I have on the right, which is enhance the value contrast on the main object, which is the turtle, and reduce the value contrast in the background, which is a very typical. I mean, most artwork wants to reduce value contrast in the background so that your subject matter shows up. So then we have Karen's amazing picture here that she painted from a photo. And she said this was from a workshop and she wanted to maybe turn it into fiber art, bigger image than what she painted. So, and she gave me some measurements here and maybe a fabric collage. And so she has a lot of really cool ideas for this. So, I think there's some cast shadow on these from taking the photo, but her original photo that she used for source material is on the left and her paintings on the right. And you did a really amazing job. I love this. So if we take this one and take a look at the rule of thirds, on the left-hand side is the rule of thirds on the original painting. On the right-hand side, I nudged it a little. It was so close. And I nudged it so that the little pump there would be exactly on that third line. But what's also going on that's really nice is the upper left-hand corner, so that the angle there between in the building between one wall and the other is directly on that line, and the door lines up with the horizontal line, which, and this was taken from a photograph by a photographer who clearly knew how to do good composition. So, so some of this was already there or nearly there, but this would be a really nice composition. I mean, it's already a nice composition, but what I do is I try to nudge my compositions a little bit closer to exact on a lot of cases, not all. So this is my quilt of Mila that was in the show, and I'm putting in here because Karen said maybe she wants to do it with the fabric collage or something. And that's what this is. This is fabric collage, and we'll show a little bit about the light and shadow on this in a minute. Here's another fabric collage of mine. So this is, you can see in the close-up of the Dalai Lama here that it's a lot of little fabric pieces and a lot of stitching. If we go back to Mila's, this is a lot more simple. This has much fewer pieces in it, but it's still effective. And then this shows kind of the range of a lot more details you can get if you want. A funny thing happened with this when it was exhibited at Mid-Atlantic Quilt Festival quite a few years ago, and I got an award. I don't know I think it was for best use of color or something. Anyway, I was standing by it handing out my business cards, and a woman came up and said, "Oh, that's gorgeous. Who is it?" And I'm like, "Oh my God. I didn't get, I didn't get the likeness." And, so my heart just sank. And I said, "It's the Dalai Lama." And she said, "Who's that?" So I was saved because she didn't even know who he was. So, of course, she wouldn't recognize him. Funny. Anyway, when the way I started with that is to get a lot of photographs. And when you're doing a person, especially, it's always good to get as many photos you can as front and side so that you can get a sense of how they look in 3D. And I took all these pictures. I was very lucky to be sitting in the front row center at William and Mary when he came to speak. And that picture on the left, as you can see, he was looking right at me. I had an actual camera at that time, um, an old SLR camera, and I was not aware of the photos that I was taking. As I was taking them, I was just snapping them. So it wasn't until I got home that I saw that he was looking right at me, like into my soul. It was so cool. But anyway, I gathered a bunch of photos and then, did a bunch of sketches. And that little sketch on the lower right there is a sketch that I did in Photoshop where I combined some images and then changed the color. And then I started putting the fabric pieces together. So this is what I'm explaining to Karin and everyone else. You want to look at light, shadow, and reflected light. Now, whenever you have light and shadow on an object, you generally always have some reflected light. If you asked an average person, does the shadow get darker as it gets further away from the light? They're probably going to say yes, because that really makes sense, right? Because further away from the light means darker usually. But actually what happens is light hits other objects and bounces back. And so there is generally a slightly lighter value called the reflected light. So we'll see how that fits in here in just a minute. So in this piece, I have cut out the light area, and then there's the shadow. And so yeah, you can see the light and the shadow there. I don't have the reflected light in yet. But this shows how I cut out the shadow. So I drew all this stuff on the back of Stevenson 2 and then cut it out. And I actually do cut out with the little rotary cutter. It's a lot faster than scissors. Some of the little tiny angles I'll use scissors, but the little tiny rotary cutter is pretty accurate going around edges after you've practiced a little bit. So then I started putting in, the background. And you see some white. This is on muslin. You see some white in between the light and the shadow. That's because I'm going to add other fabrics in there. And here they are, some kind of medium value. It's a reddish color, red violet, and it's a little darker than the light and a little lighter than the shadow. So that's what's going to blend one into the other because the value's in between. So here we see a little bit on the left, and I've done a little on the left. It's laying down on the table, and you see my tweezers there because I'm starting to put in some little tiny pieces. And then on the right, it's hanging up. There are a few darks in here that look abnormally dark, but those will be most of them covered over with other fabrics eventually. But this, it could be finished right here on the right. I went ahead and did a bunch more, but there's in this type of fabric collage, if you're doing like realistic fabric collage with your values and stuff, there's a lot of places where you can decide to stop and let it be finished at that point. So there's the reflected light finally, that little bit of sort of turquoise on the edge there. It's a little lighter than the shadow. Now the reason it's turquoise is because I'm showing a green background and I'm showing a dark blue shadow. And if the dark blue shadow had green light reflected back on it, it would become turquoise. So that's why I picked that color. So this is my old studio. And actually the tabard on the left there of Lakshmi is also done in this same exact technique with the fabric collage. And then on the upper right there, you see two paintings I did when I lived in Arizona. One's in Sedona and one's in Prescott. And those will eventually be some fiber art in this type of technique. So after I got all the fabric on, then I stitched all over, and this is the back. So it was the top layer, and the middle layer was some thin batting. I probably use Thermore for this because I do a lot of layered quilts where I layer, I basically am making two quilts and then putting them together. So when I do that, I use thinner batting. But it also has muslin on it, so you can see the stitching on the back of the muslin. And I didn't change my bobbin for every single color change, but for groups of color changes. So some of the colored threads are a little bit different on the top, but you can see how stitching all these colors of thread enhance the look. I use a lot of times what I'll do is if I'm blending a light color into a darker color, the thread I choose is the thread that's between those two values, and that serves to blend it. But as I said, you could have stopped, a long way before where I took the Dalai Lama, more at this stage, which is where the quilt of Mila is. And you can see on her, I also used turquoise reflected light on the light's coming from the other side on her, so the reflected light is on the right-hand side. But that would be perfect. And the thing that's fun about it is you can just keep adding. And at some point, you can stop adding. You can decide as you go. Okay, so this is showing on Milo, where the light, the shadow, and the reflected light are. And this is if you want a realistic look in your quilt, which oftentimes I do. I started out as a painter and an artist. My teacher studied with Norman Rockwell, and I learned traditional painting. And the reason I got into fiber art was I became allergic to oil paint after teaching for 10 years in my first art school. And so I couldn't use oil paint anymore. So I'm like, what am I going to do? And I still wanted to paint. So I developed this technique. This was in 1984. Started to develop this technique of how to use fabric in a painterly way. The problem was we didn't have Steam-A-Seam 2 then. We only had stitch witchery, and that stuff curled up. And if you ironed it down, that was ironed forever, and you couldn't change your mind. The difference with the stitch witchery is it's sort of like a Post-it note, so you can pick it up and move it around. And it wasn't until that product became available that I really ran with this technique. So back to Karin's wonderful image here in painting. So if we look at a cylinder, we notice we have light on the right. If the light's coming from the right, light on the right, shadow in the middle, and a little bit of reflected light on the left. Now, on Karin's, we don't really notice any reflected light. On the actual photo, if you enlarge it really, really big, you can start to see a little bit of reflected light there. And that's one of the things we have to do as artists, is to know what's supposed to be there, because the camera does not pick up everything. The camera has only one eye, and whereas we have two. So the perspective in a camera is going to be different than how we see it. A lot of the colors are different in a camera. Camera will oftentimes pick up a deeper blue hue than what's the blue that's really out there. So it's good to know what the camera does differently. And a lot of times the camera doesn't show the slight differences in value that we can see with our actual eyes. So, if it was me, because I know that there should be, that it looks better with reflected light on the left, I would put a little more. Now this cylinder that I show here in charcoal on the left, that shows about half light and half shadow. And on Karin's, it's not. On Karin's, there's a little more light and a little less shadow. So, you just have to move the shadow over. But you can still show reflected light. And Karin, I would probably, since the light, since the light's, based on where the light's coming, that little garden piece at the bottom made out of the brick that's holding the flowers, that is actually a portion of a cylinder. You could even think of it as being chopped out of a cylindrical shape. So that, let me see if you can see my arrow here, this portion here would want to get a little darker as it goes to the left. In fact, the shadow relationship on this piece here should be a carbon copy of what you put here in terms of the proportion of light that's showing and the proportion of shadow. So, okay. Oh, and I'm also showing here a little bit more blended edge here. Now, and that, if you're doing that in fabric, you know, you can't blend fabric the way you blend with a paintbrush, but the way you would blend it is by using gradated values of little pieces of fabric, one next to the other. So you can see on this one, the photo, the lightest area is right here, about 20% in from the side, right? And it gets a little darker to the right-hand side from that center, and it gets a little darker to the left-hand side from that center, because we see this little highlight up here on the top. So the highlights all tell us exactly where the light's coming from. So you could use that in your painting or in your fiber art, is getting the right-hand edge of this just slightly darker helps turn the form. And what turn the form means, it helps a round form looks like it's rounding around away from you. So those are just a couple of tips. This is great. I think it'll make a fabulous, fabulous fiber art piece. I would, to keep a focus on the little pump here and the flowers in the front, whatever I used in the background here of this ivy or whatever it is, I would use fabrics that are much less contrasty in value, and maybe a little bit more blendy, maybe even some Bali batiks. And I love how you made that brick wall more red, and that is excellent contrast with this pump. So I would definitely warm up, even the cinder block wall. I would warm both of those up to a little bit orangey, because orange is the opposite of blue, and you'll get a nice contrast there. You did a good job with your flowers too, getting that contrast of warm and cool better than the photo. So that tells me you are familiar with those concepts, and that's really good. And look at everybody, look at the things she left out on the door. Isn't that great? Those two little, whatever they are, things on the door, you know, they don't add to the picture, and neither does the thing on the wall there that looks like it's an outlet. So she leave that out. So what you leave out is and she left out that little grate. So what you leave out is as important as what you keep in. So this is showing what I just talked about before on Karin's painting, the light, the midtone going to the shadow on the left, and the photo. In the photo you see a little, it's hard to see, but this light area is really a little more moved to the left, that very lightest area, with it just getting slightly darker to the side. And even if that's closer to the light, the reason it gets darker is because it's curving away from us. So every time a form curves away from you, it doesn't reflect the light as efficiently back to your eye. And so if it's not reflecting light efficiently, that means it has to be darker. So this is a Munsell color chart, and if you want to learn more about color, I do teach some classes at this, and I do it in private lessons, but you can just research Munsell color chart. And so the value is on the left, the gray value going from darkest to lightest. And then in the middle there, you see those reds. So those reds, every one of those red swatches is a number 4 value. In other words, if I desaturated this or did a black and white photo, every one of those reds would look exactly the same gray that's on that horizontal level. The first gray here is mostly gray with a little red, and then you add more red, more red, more red, more red to the most red on the right-hand side. And so in addition to keeping track of what values, you want to keep track of chroma. So what's going on here is the mid-tone has a lot of chroma in it. And actually, in real life, what would happen is the light area would have the most chroma because it's light that creates color. And then as that value going around the cylinder gets a little darker, it's moving towards the shadow. It's not in the shadow yet, but it's moving away from the light and towards the shadow. It loses chroma, which is intensity of color or in saturation. So I've circled kind of here in circled, squared in red. This one at the top would probably be the color and the value, maybe a little bit more intense color if you have it for the light. But then this next one down here would be the mid-tone, and I'd want to make that a little bit grayer. So that way the light looks more light. And then down here at the bottom, the shadow, I would guess the shadow, I put a box around two of them somewhere in that darker value. So and Karin did a real good job with the shadow here, but be careful with shadows. One of the biggest mistakes people make about shadow is putting too much color in it. And then it looks a little weird. And so, now you can have artistic reasons for why you do that, and that's fine. And if you can support those reasons in your artwork, no problem. But if you want it to look realistic, you do want the shadow to be what we call low chroma or low saturation of chroma. And that means it has a little gray in it. Be careful of too much black. You usually don't want to get black in your painting or your art quilts. So I did a show with my Tidewater Quilters Guild in February. This was a fashion show of a bunch of my wearable art. And then I taught a class called Wearable Art Academy, which went from March 16th till June 1st, where I had students who made some of these things. And they had questions and problems. So since I only had two people from TAVA with questions, I thought I would show a couple of these. So this is Iris's piece, at a stage of being partly done. And Iris has the embroidery machine, and her theme was hummingbirds. And she did this amazing circular piece of embroidery for the back. And she showed the picture on the left, and she was trying to figure out what to do next. So the first thing that I did was on the right, I put a dark line around that hummingbird. Because on the left, you notice that the eye is focused more on details lower in the garment. And if you don't want people to look at your butt, then you want to raise the area of interest a little higher. So, and not only that, that's the most important piece on the back. She did this amazing embroidery. So what happens then is, because I put the darker violet around the outside edge next to that muslin background, that became the area of the highest contrast, light against dark. And that is what the eye is going to go towards every time. So that was one, and she's still working on this, but it's coming along and it's going to be totally amazing. So this is Trisha's. So in my classes, we use a series of cherry wood hand-dyed gradations, a group of 8, and then we coordinate our colors to that, so it makes it easy. So Trisha wanted to do dragonflies, and she found this big dragonfly panel in the middle, and she ordered it, and when it arrived, it was way too big to put on a jacket. So she was like, what do I do next? And this is interesting because a lot of times, I'm sure some of you have had this happen, the very first piece of fabric that we love, that we think is going to be the main fabric in our piece, is the one that we don't use. And yet everything we do is built upon that. And so after she decided this was too big, then she went looking and she found out that this was a discontinued line, but she also found the little panel, I think they're 10-inch blocks, they might be 12, to the right. So that's a much better size for wearables. So she got those. And then this is what she started working out. She also found that border print at the top, which was also in the same one of the coordinates for that. So we, as you can see on the left, those beautiful little panel pieces, squares, had this horrible, horrible, bright, bright. I mean, I couldn't believe how bright that blue was. It was a brighter blue than I think I've ever seen in printed fabric. And it was horrible for the background because it overtook everything. So we just got another fabric and put it around. As you can see on the right, we framed it. I think that's just pinned, but we put four corners on and then uh, four sides so that it made an octagon towards a circle. And then she did on the left hand side, those 8 fabrics in the bottom are her cherrywood fabrics. And so we worked out how to do them in flying geese and in Seminole patchwork. And so this is the techniques that I teach is you kind of develop it as you go along. So I teach the techniques and everybody makes a bunch of them and then decides where they're going to go. So on the right hand side, what you're seeing primarily in the middle there is the back of a sleeveless long vest. And then on the 2 sides, you're seeing the 2 fronts. They're just folded back. So she's doing an amazing job here. And this brown fabric that we see on the left is going to be underneath because the cattails are really important to her. And so we went back to the original thing and we decided that, you don't have to use the whole thing intact. So we could cut a couple of strips where we could use cattails. And so she might be doing that. We'll see. The other idea we had was to make our own cattails with iron-on bias binding and an oblong applique of brown velveteen, which is nice because every time you get another texture in there, it, you know, it adds a lot. And so this is Catherine. She's also taking the class, but she's not making a wearable. And even though I call it Wearable Art Academy, people do not have to make a wearable. They can use the techniques they learn for wall pieces. And Catherine is a brand new beginning quilter. She's only been quilting for a short time. And so she wanted to do something a little bit easy that she could learn some techniques. So she found this amazing mermaid panel on the left, which I absolutely love. I mean, it's so artistic and awesome. And so what she's going to do is the flying geese around it. And notice how those flying geese are low contrast. They're kind of middle to middle light to middle dark values. There's nothing in the outside frame there that's as light as the lightest lights in the center panel or as dark as the darkest darks. And when I was in art school, I used to be a framer. I worked in a frame shop. And so I do think in terms of framing my quilts and feeling like there's a frame around them. So that's where that comes from. So this is going to be gorgeous. And what a beautiful balance of warm and cool, huh? So the extra cool of the mostly greens and blues in the outside frame really lets the gold in the center pop. Now we tried it once without those 4 gold boxes in the corners, and the frame looked a little too divorced from the image in the center. So we put a little bit of a darker gold in the 4 corners, and that tied the yellow in the center in, which is really nice. So here's my most recent piece. This is my leopard power goddess garment, which I made, whenever I teach the wearable art classes, I always make one too. And so I had a couple of problems and issues with this, which I'll show you a couple how I solve them. So this was my original fabric that I wanted to use. It turned out I didn't, but this was how I found out I wasn't going to. So I wanted to do a kaleidoscope, and you notice by the white arrows that this particular fabric has reverse image of these leopards. So my idea was to do a kaleidoscope, which is 8 of these triangles with 4 pairs, which each of these leopards facing each other. I didn't want to use up my fabric. So once I drew, I don't know, I hope you can see there's chalk lines there. I actually took the fabric itself and placed it on my copy machine, and I made black and white copies so I could cut those out and see how the design was going to work before I cut up my precious fabric. So as you can see, I put 4 together in the bottom, and I didn't want to cut out 4 and use up. I'm so stingy. I didn't want to waste my fabric. I didn't want to waste my black ink. I didn't even print this as dark as it should have been. And then I only printed 4 instead of 8. And on the right-hand side, I put it next to a mirror so I could see how it would look with 8. And it was okay. It wasn't that interesting to me. I mean, I felt like it needed something. The image itself was a little bit small inside of the triangle, the image of the leopard. So then I found this other leopard fabric on the right, which I thought, well, that's bigger and that might be a little more exciting. So I did the same thing with that. I made black and white copies and cut them out and put them together and looked at the top, and I thought, well, that's boring. So I really liked those leopards, and I thought, well, what can I do to make it less boring? So the first thing I did was switch to a, what is this, a 60-degree triangle instead of 45. So what that means is there's going to be 6 pieces instead of 8, so each of the pieces is a little bigger. Because back here, I noticed at the top right, those leopard heads looked awfully crowded in that triangle. And then the other thing I did was I angled the head. So notice the center line of the head, which goes up through the center of the mouth, the nose, and between the eyes, is at an angle compared to this. On this one, that center line is straight up and down, exactly centered with the triangle, which is what makes it so boring. So this, you'll see, gets a little more action to it. And so what I do is, yeah, so that red line there on the template shows the angle of the center line of the head. And I put tape on there and I draw a couple of the features so that when I put that ruler on top of the different motifs in the fabric, I can line it up each time. So it did work. You can see this is what it finally turned into. And you can see there's a lot more action. If you squint your eyes, you can see that the values give it a little bit of movement. And after I did the triangle of the leopard cut out of that fabric, I did use a little bit of stitch and flip, similar to paper piecing, to add that little pop of orange in the center, and then on the outside edge, the 3 colors of green, because it didn't have enough color to go with the rest of the garments. So that's how I solved that problem. It's still a little big. I would have liked it better if the images were a little smaller, but I probably have every fabric with leopards on it ever created. So you are limited to, what you can find. So this shows what it looks like after I cut out my 6 pieces. That was a yard of fabric. And I think I only could have gotten 1 or maybe 2 more out of this. So that's the reason why I like to do the copies on the copy machine, because then I don't cut up my fabric and find out it's not going to work. If I had done that with the first version, with the kaleidoscope, and then I didn't like it, I would have been stuck, because you can't get this anymore. So then I had another idea. I wanted to include the Egyptian goddess Sechet in this. She's shown wearing a leopard outfit, and she is kind of a scribe. She's about measuring, which of course I do a lot with quilting, and she's also a scribe, and I'm actually also a book editor. So, there were qualities that she had that were important to me that I wanted to put on this coat. So I had to figure out how to do her, and I first thought I was going to make my own applique, and after I designed it, I decided, no, we're not going to do that. So then I remembered, I thought I had something. So this piece on the lower left is actually a linen piece that I bought probably 30 years ago. It's bigger than what's shown there. It has, I think, 8 figures on it. Only 1 is a woman. So there you go, patriarchy at its best. But I thought, well, why couldn't I change her? So I'm like a paper doll. I made her a little leopard dress. And then I wanted her hand to be holding the stylus for being the scribe. So I cut up other arms of other figures on that cloth. And so it sort of looked like a horror room of dismemberment in my studio with all these little cut up body parts, and I put them together. And even her arm, her left arm, which is on the right hand side, is a different arm than the arm she had. If you look in the panel at the lower left, you see her left arm was reaching out, and I didn't want her left arm to reach out. I wanted it to reach down so that she could hold the Ankh cross, which you can see in the little image in the upper left. So I did that, and I used Stevenson 2 and just colored over it. But the bigger problem was the colors. Her colors were red and blue and this mint green, which really were not part of my colorway. But because I know colors, I knew if I colored the whole thing over with yellow, that the red would turn into orange, the blue would turn into green, and the mint green would turn into a warmer green. And then even the little ribbon she has around her head, I turned that from red into orange. So it would go with my range of colors. And you can see those colors in that little fan piece in the upper left-hand corner. So I have Sharpies in every color there is, and I highly recommend that. Oh, the other thing I did, this is a really good secret. I had not done it by the time I took this picture. But see how these little zigzag stitch looks really sloppy up there? You can see the green through there. I don't worry about that because when I'm done zigzag stitching, I go over that with my Sharpie pen and make it look all even. So then we have my Inanna Queen of the Sun, Moon, and Stars. This is the piece that was in Mid-Atlantic Quilt Festival last February. I got first place for Wearable Art Ensemble and first place for Viewer's Choice, which was really nice. And so I'm just going to show you a couple of problems that I ran into. Many problems here with this one. I bit off way more than I could chew, and as I often do, and thought about killing myself halfway through, which I often that's an exaggeration, but there is a place in every project that you feel like, I am so stuck. There is no answer to this. I'll never fix it. And a lot of people just throw their pieces in the closet at that point. And there are some of my pieces in the closet like that. But you know, there's an answer to everything. And once you get the answer and you push through, it is so exhilarating to solve that and figure it out. So this is the pieces. This is a cape. I used a cape pattern with 3 pieces, a front and 2 backs, and I redrafted it into 12 pieces so that there were 6 pieces in the front and 6 in the back. And then I cut them out of muslin and then stitched these blue strips to it. Obviously in a value gradation, starting with the darkest at the bottom and getting lighter as it went towards the top. And so so these are the rays that I sewed together, and they are also stitched. This is before they were trimmed, but these are the colors stitched onto some strips of muslin, which I then trimmed down to make the rays that you see in the garment there. So my idea here was to cover the seams. So if you look at the garment on the left there, you see where it's folded over, you can see the lining. That was the lining fabric, amazing fabric by Sue Penn. And so on the right hand side, when I'm sewing together the wedges of the cape, I'm sewing them wrong sides together, and I'm putting my seam allowance on the right side. And so that's what you see, those 2 seam allowances on the left. And the reason for that is because I want it to look neat on the inside. This is the lining of this fabric is part of sewing it all together. I don't put a separate lining in to cover up mistakes. I just try not to make mistakes. So once that seam allowance is there, then the plan was to cover it up. And I was going to cover it up with these strips. And the strips are created as a completely finished independent piece. So that means they would either be, the long sides would either be turned over and top stitched down, or I would put a finishing strip on the edge, which would typically be a skinny bias strip that would cover those raw edges and fold underneath. And that's what I wanted to do. But here is, oh, and here's a long sideways view so you can see what it looks like. So the whole idea here was the top is on the left, that the lighter values would be at the top, descending to darker values at the bottom. And I wanted to enhance that feeling. So if we look here, if we look at what I could put on the edges, you can see what the problem is. On the top edge here, if I put a dark edging, then it had a lot of hard contrast at the top. Didn't look too good in my estimation because I'm trying to keep the top light. And then by the time it gets to the bottom, it disappeared. So I didn't like that. So then we try a middle value. So the middle value still shows up a lot at the top and the bottom. Not so much it disappears in the middle. I didn't like that. And then I tried a light one, and that didn't work either because it disappeared at the top, and then it created a focal point at the bottom, which is definitely what I did not want, because it creates a focal point by being the lightest light next to the darkest dark. So then everyone's going to look at the bottom of the cape. Not what I wanted. So I searched and searched and searched for ombre fabrics and even bought a few of them, and none of them were going to work. And I knew from the beginning what I was going to probably have to do, and I rebelled against it and rebelled and bought $75 worth of fabric as part of my rebellion, and ended up doing what I knew I had to do anyway, which was this. So I bought polyester satin in gradations of yellows. Now, the dark yellow is brown and dark orange is brown. Brown is not a separate color. It's a dark value of either yellow or orange, depending on whether it's, really warm or not. So I bought these. I was not able to buy them at one store in person. I had to buy them online. So I didn't know which ones were going to work exactly until I got them. And a couple of them, I used the back side of them instead of the front side to get the right value. So I sewed all these together and then cut my bias strip. And on the right here, let's see, you can see how the dark values at the bottom and how the values of those strips get a little lighter as it goes up. So it enhances the feeling of the light coming from the crown at the top, which represents the sun. I believe I had 80 different cherry wood fabrics in those two. There were two different strips, one that started, they all start with yellow, but one that went from yellow into orange and the other one went from yellow into green. And that's my messy studio. So here you can see it in action on the, now some of the values look a little different here because it's a shiny fabric, so it depends on how the lights hits it, but that's basically how it looked. You can see it, I think, maybe a little better on the right. At the right, it's sewn together, so trying to lay a cape down flat that's been sewn together, that's why there's all those ripples. And in the bottom, the reason I did 12 sections is because I wanted to use the 12 zodiac signs, because Inanna is an ancient Sumerian goddess who is queen of the sun, moon, and stars and the zodiac. So, but then I had another problem with the zodiac. I did them in the 12 colors, darkened value colors of the primary, secondary, and tertiary colors. But then the problem was, well, what do I do to, how do I put an edging on that works for all 12 colors in the background? So that was another corner I painted myself into. And I don't have a really good picture, but you can see that this bias binding here around the Pisces one is kind of a gray color. I ended up sacrificing this amazing gray plaid. It was just a very subtle plaid between kind of a medium gray value and a slightly darker medium gray value. And it was such lightweight wool. It was like I forget what they call it, but it was almost like a wool batiste. And I remember it being $100 a yard, and it was the only thing that would work for this. That was a big sacrifice, but it worked perfectly. It did exactly what I wanted around the edges of those medallions, because I had to use something that looked good with every one of 12 colors plus the background. So here it is finished. And the idea here is that the crown is like the sun. And so, that's what the light source is coming down. And I put the bottom is stuffed velveteen, get that little velvet look. So the last thing to talk about here is Sedna, Queen of the Deep. This is my piece that just got accepted into the Cherrywood Challenge this year. And so the challenge was called Abyss, and you got these 6 sort of teal shades and then 6 contrast shades, but they didn't give you very much of that. They called them droplets. So when you bought your set, you got, I think, a fat quarter or a half yard, depending on what you bought, of the main colors. And then little tiny pieces, like, I don't know, they were probably 5 by 9 inches, because they didn't want you to use too much. So this is how I started mine. I decided I was going to do strips across. And so here they are, sewing strips together. And then this was a piece I did about 30 years ago, and there's a mermaid stitched there in the wave. I'll show you. So that's to show you where the stitching is. And I always liked that and wanted to do another one. So I decided to do that again. And so I traced her from a bad photo. I don't own that quilt anymore. And I couldn't see to trace the hand. So I found a hand online and just stuck it on there so that I could use it for guidance. And then this is the drawing that I came up with for that. And so I'm fooling around with where to locate it on here. So you can see I'm using the rule of thirds here to put her head in the right hand area, and definitely did not want her nipple to be on any of those lines where they crossed, because you don't want that to be the main thing people look at. So I'm playing, and I also played around with the Fibonacci spiral, which is sacred geometry, and I just plugged that on top to see, what would happen. And I did adjust some of my lines to fit in. This has 2 Fibonacci spirals on there. And you can look this up. The Fibonacci spiral is a part of sacred geometry, and it's how a lot of things in nature grow, including, you can probably guess, the chambered nautilus. And so people really respond positively to this particular arc sequence. So here we are starting again. There's my drawing on tracing paper. I pinned it to actually, I didn't even sew those pieces together. This is a drawing in Pages, because I forgot to take a photo. But I just cut those strips of fabric and slapped them on there, and I put a little bit of steam too along the edge. I did cut them with wiggly lines. They weren't straight like this, but there was no sewing on there until I did this. So there's the drawing on the tracing paper. And so here I'm stitching through it. So that's how I get a really good drawing on there, is by stitching through that. And when you look at this really close, you can see that I've been really careful to keep my stitching on the inside of those black lines. So that's it again. This is what the back looks like. I stitched it directly onto Thermore, no muslin backing. This is another layered quilt. And so I tie all those threads. There's the threads I had to tie. And here I am picking out the tracing paper with a tweezer, so, which takes a while. My intern was there that day and she took this picture. So that shows the process. You have to be careful so you don't pull out your stitches. And so then I had her stitched on there. So then I used artist paint sticks, also called oil bars by Shiva. And I had some stencils with some background under the sea stuff. I was going for a look where the mermaid was, beyond, like in the water. And Then I use Prismacolor pencils too. So Prismacolor pencils are a wax base, and if you draw with them on fabric and you iron them, the iron will meld the wax into the fabric, and so it's sort of semi-permanent. The oil bars become permanent all on their own after 48 hours. I think you can iron them if you want, but you don't have to. So this is what my design wall looked like. I had a couple of circles made up there to work out my pattern and my design. I made a template circle. On the right, you can see I'm using it like a stencil so I can keep track of what's going on inside the area that I'm working on the quilt. The fabric you see underneath is on the back. You're not allowed to use any fabrics other than cherry wood on the front, but you can use anything on the back. And I thought, I found that piece in my collection. I thought, I can imagine anything more perfect to coordinate on the back. So, and then I decided I was gonna make piping out of this. So no, I did not use the little 5 by 9 inch fabrics they gave me. I had to order half-yard pieces of every one of these colors so I could cut these long strips and then make piping cord out of them, which you see here. There's the piping cord made. And on the right, I'm wrapping it around to make sure I have enough to go around there. And then here I'm using a compass to make a perfect circle. This is a great compass because it has a clip on the right and it'll hold any size thing. So I just used a Sharpie marker and got that exact and then cut it out, added the piping and my bias binding. And then these are little bubbles that I made. So this is how I made them. I used plastic drapery hooks, which you can actually cover. This is my faux shisha mirror technique, except that I'm not using shiny fabric under it, but you just get drapery hooks and you can cover them with a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine. You just have to, stay alert and be aware so that your needle doesn't break on the plastic. I usually save needles and I use old needle for this because it doesn't have to go through anything. And then if you break it, it's no big deal. So you can see on the left, I've started with one, and on the right, I'm about completed. And on the lower right, I'm using a very small drapery hook. And the reason the scissors are there are not to cut anything is because it was too small for me to get my fingers under there to nudge it. So I actually used the scissors to kind of nudge it around. And then you take the same color thread and stitch right through it onto the quilt. Now this, I put that little orangey peach color cut underneath and then plopped the little drapery hook on top and stitched it. And you could see the stitching in there. I also stitched a bunch of waves and stuff. So this is a double quilt. I do a lot of quilts that are kind of layered like this, excuse me. So the one quilt is on the left, the circular piece is done. They're both exactly 20 inches. And the one on the right doesn't need anything in the middle because I'm going to plop that piece on top. So I only put on there what I absolutely had to create 4 corners. And I've learned my lesson to always put a little more than I think because I've gotten too close to the edge before. So here I'm got the circular quilt on top of the square quilt. And the way I'm attaching it is by stitching in the ditch between the piping cord and the bias. And there it is finished. And this is a picture early on. I continued to add color as time went on. The Prismacolor tends to sink into the fabric and kind of disappear a little bit, so I kept adding it. And also, I made this enlargement so you could see the stitching. This is lighter, this image is lighter than it really is. The thread that I used for the outline is not nearly that light, but the light circumstance, I took it and made it look lighter, and it turned out to be better for teaching because you can see the stitching better. This is a little better. So this is after a few more layers of, I did use white acrylic paint for the highlights in the eye, and I darkened the iris, the pupil of the eye with a black Sharpie pen. So that area between the highlight of her eye and her pupil is the highest contrast of anything in the image. So it's good if viewers look at the eyes. And then her necklace is made out of genuine natural pearls, which are darker than white. I didn't want to use white. And you can see up at the top, it looks too bright, but there's one of those bubbles up there. And so I added bubbles in colored pencil and oil bars and rhinestones and beads and all kinds of stuff. So there's the finished thing. So our hand is reaching out, and in her hand is the pearl of wisdom, which is also not white. I didn't want to put any white pearls in this. So that was also a natural color, but round pearl. And so anyway, that's
Meryl Ann, you have two questions in regard of that piece in the chat.
Oh, thank you. All right, let me go take a look. Do you wash your cherry wood fabric before using? Usually, but not always. You're supposed to. So, oh, the eyebrows. Okay, so you are supposed to wash your cherry wood fabric before using, and I often do, but once in a while I don't, and that's bad. Slap my hand. Okay, eyebrows. Let's go. Thank you for that. Let's go back and we'll look. Messy Studio. Yeah, the eyebrows are just a thin stitch, and then I did put some little pencil eyebrow in there. And by not making them too dark, and because they're positioned close to the eye, which has the highest contrast in the image, what that means is people are not going to look at the eyebrows as much. There's a lot of times that you can get away with something in your artwork that's not as complete or as good as you really want it by making something else the focal point, and then people just won't look. I can't tell you how many mistakes I have in my leopard outfit because I was rushing to do that. I was trying to keep up with my students in the class, and there's more mistakes in that than I've ever made in any garment. I would never enter it into a show, but nobody sees any of them because there's so much stuff going on. So that's how you do that. People ask me how I became an embellisher. I said, well, I didn't like to take out my mistakes. I just like to, hypnotize people with detail. So anyway, that's my Messy Studio, a portion of it. And I have a monthly newsletter that's free. It's called the Wearable Art and Textiles Scuttlebutt on purpose because it spells out twat. And I think that anybody that calls you bad names, you need to turn that name around and turn it into a good thing. So that was my little wild feminist reaction to that. But anyway, a lot's about wearable art, but a lot is about other types of art. It's only 2 pages, and it comes out once a month whenever I get around to it. And once in a while I miss a month, and then I apologize. So you can get that for free if you want. It's just a PDF, 2 pages. And then on my website, if you want to see some really cool pictures of wearable art, you can go under the drop down under workshops and lectures of Wearable Art Academy, which you see that page on the right hand side, and you can drop down and look at some really cool techniques, which obviously could be anything, a wall piece as well as wearable art. And if any of you are interested in coming to that, you can make a wall hang. And then I also do private art instruction. I do that online as well as in person in my studio. And this is a gift. So this is one of the things in my studio I use more than anything else. It was in my father's workroom as long as I remember, since I was 4. That was in the 1950s. And it tells you decimal equivalents for fractions. And so there's a lot of times in quilting where that kind of information is so useful, and I hate to do the math every time. So I still had that tattered old decimal equivalent thing, which he had, which was old when I saw it. So I'm guessing the original was close to 100 years old, and the copyright's gone, and there wasn't any copyright on it anyway. And so I tweaked it. I cleaned it up in Photoshop and turned it into something that would make a nice poster. and then I copyrighted it myself. And so if anybody wants that, all you have to do to get that is to email me with that subject heading, which is not only in the chat, but it's also Karen sent it out in the other thing. So that's it. Art is not a luxury. It's essential foodstuff for the soul. So we should all go out and make some and be healthy. So I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has any.
Wow, that was a wealth of information. Wow. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. I know it's a lot. I have a lot of stuff, and I took a lot of stuff out because I thought it was too much. But, you know, my students in the wearable art class, this is how we did every class. I did the slideshow, but then they have access to the recording. So you can always go back. And they also got handouts. They got like 80 pages of instructional handouts. So you can really do a lot of it by just the handout, but if you forget, you can go back and look. So it's, you know, Zoom is a cool thing. So
Meryl, this is Leslie. I just want to thank you for all of your feedback on my photos. It was really helpful, very helpful.
you're welcome. And I
And
just,
your,
yeah, go ahead.
your work is absolutely beautiful.
Thank you. Well, I want to let you know that, you know, I'm not in any way attached to anybody taking my advice. Part of the path, you know, is exploring all the creative options. And so for you and Karen, who, you know, we talked a little bit about it today, you might only be, the creative options I offered might only be halfway to where you're going to end up going. But it takes making those steps and trying a new thing and looking at each thing before you can move forward. So,
Yeah. Well, it's very helpful. Thank you.
oh, good. I'm glad. I'm glad. Okay.
Yeah. I like the way how you enlightened the turtle more and had the background more subdued and how much you changed it.
Oh,
Mhm.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
didn't thought about that. Yes.
Yeah, that's really important. And that could be something that you would do in your one with the little pump is the flowers in the bed in the background, you make those values a little grayer and a little
Yeah.
closer in value, and then the ones in the foreground will pop.
Yeah, I may just put some netting over it.
Yeah,
But
that'll
just
do it too.
subdue that. That's a very good idea. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, netting is a great way. And I have used black and white bridal netting tool together to get a middle value gray to put
Mhm.
over something. So cool. Any other? Oh, who's 296326? Who is that?
I think that's Gwen.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'm sorry, I don't know your prison number.
Uh-huh.
Oh, that's funny. So any other questions? Yeah, no? Well, I hope I gave you some food for thought.
Thank you so
Very
much.
much.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And we'll send out the link as soon as it's available. So if you find something. Now, I do ask people who watch it, if you are looking for something specific on there and you find it, if you email me the timestamp, I'll collect all the timestamps that people send and put it into one thing and send it out. I don't have time to go through it myself. Excuse me. And make timestamps for everything that I talked about. But if you send them in, we'll compile them, and that makes it easier for people to find. So anyway, okay. Well, I hope you guys got a little bit of ideas for future things. That's what this is all about.
Yeah.
And I'll look forward to seeing what everyone does.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I guess we're done for
Bye.
today. See you all next time. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.